$10 trillion gone. That's not monopoly money. That's real cash, real assets, real blood, sweat and tears completely erased from the face of the earth in 2008. No guns fired, no missiles launched. Yet 6 million people lost their jobs, homes were brutally foreclosed, and legendary financial institutions that practically backstopped the global economy crumbled like cheap dominoes. You think Wall Street is a gathering of the greatest minds in human history? Think again. In 2008, it was a glorified casino, a playground where guys in bespoke suits gambled away your entire future for a quick buck. What the hell happened? Let's look under the hood and see exactly how these Ivy League geniuses managed to torch the world's wealth. Let's strip away the corporate PR and look at the raw truth. Macroeconomics sounds high and mighty, but the core of the 2008 crash boils down to the most primal, raw human traits: unadulterated greed at the top and naive financial blindness at the bottom. This disaster didn't materialize overnight. It was a perfectly engineered, highly sophisticated trap laid out over a decade. And the ones setting the bait? The very institutions stamped with the highest labels of trust on the planet. We are taught from childhood that to make money, you have to work. To build wealth, you have to save. But Wall Street completely rewrote the rulebook. They provided to the world that the fastest way to mint billions isn't through labor, it's through manufacturing illusions. And the grandest, most intoxicating illusion in America at the time was real estate. The American dream of owning a home with a white picket fence. That very dream was weaponized by financial predators to slice, dice, and bleed the economy dry until there wasn't a single drop left to extract. Let's rewind to the early 2000s to see how this trap was actually built. Back then, Wall Street was drowning in cash, ego, and expensive stakes. Banks stumbled upon a massive new cash cow: mortgages. Now, the traditional business model of a sane bank is pretty straightforward. You want to borrow my money to buy a house? Fine. But first, show me your tax returns, prove you have a steady job, and let me see your credit score. If you cannot guarantee you can pay me back, I'm slamming the door in your face. That's basic, common sense survival. But on Wall Street during the roaring 2000s, common sense was bad for business. Bankers realized that if they stayed careful, the money machine moved too slow. To get filthy rich fast, they needed scale. So they asked a crazy question: why limit our customer base to people who can actually afford to pay us back? Why not lend to the poor, the financially unstable, and the folks with horrific credit histories? And just like that, a fancy new term was minted to legitimize this insanity: subprime mortgages. It sounds academic, but let's translate that into plain English. Lending money to people who have absolutely zero means of paying it back. You don't have a steady job? No problem. No verifiable income? Who cares? Zero down payment? We've got you covered. Walk right in. Back then, if you had a pulse and a faint heartbeat, a bank would practically force a $500,000 mortgage into your hands. Sounds completely nuts, right? Well, buckle up, because the real crisis hasn't even begun yet. Why would these banks do something so reckless it bordered on financial suicide? Were they running a charity? Were they trying to help low-income families achieve the American dream? Don't be naive. The banks didn't care about the risk because they knew they wouldn't be the ones holding the bag when the music stopped. The second the ink dried on these sketchy mortgages, the banks performed a masterclass in financial alchemy. They took millions of these toxic, low-quality loans that they knew damn well would eventually default, threw them all into a giant blender, packaged them up, and slapped a fancy bow on it called a CDO, a collateralized debt obligation. This was Wall Street's weapon of mass financial destruction. Strip away the jargon and a CDO was just a box filled with toxic garbage. But the banks couldn't sell a box of garbage. So they marched these CDOs over to the credit rating agencies, the watchdogs whose sole job is to tell investors what is safe and what isn't. The banks dumped the trash on the table and said, "Give this a AAA rating now." Now, a AAA rating is the holy grail. It means virtually risk-free, the financial equivalent of US government bonds. The rating agencies looked at the pile of trash, smelled the massive advisory fees the banks were dangling in front of them, and without blinking an eye, stamped it approved AAA rating. The entire global financial market looked at that fake AAA stamp and lost its collective mind. Everyone from pension funds, managing teachers' retirements, to small European municipal banks, to Asian billionaires started buying these CDOs like crazy. They were driven by pure FOMO and a media-orchestrated vibe that American real estate only goes up. If a borrower defaults, who cares? The bank just forecloses on the house, sells it for more money, and everyone wins, right? Everyone was laughing, drinking champagne, and partying on the deck of a cruise ship heading straight for an iceberg at maximum speed. But there is an absolute law of gravity in finance. A bubble blown with toxic gas eventually explodes. By 2007, reality caught up with the hype, and it hit Wall Street like a freight train. Interest rates began to tick upward, and all those low-income borrowers who were handed predatory loans years prior woke up to a harsh reality. Their monthly mortgage payments had ballooned to twice their size. They couldn't pay, not because they wanted to scam the system, but because their pockets had been empty since day one. The defaults spread like a wildfire in a dry forest. Banks began foreclosing on homes en masse, dumping them back into the market to desperately salvage whatever cash they could. But basic economics says that when everyone's trying to sell and nobody is buying, the floor falls out. The housing market cratered. Home prices plummeted off a cliff. Overnight, those pristine AAA-rated CDO boxes that the world treated like pure gold were exposed for what they truly were: toxic waste. Global investors watched in horror as their life savings, parked in supposedly bulletproof US financial instruments, turned out to be tied to abandoned, half-built houses in the middle of nowhere. Then came the day of reckoning, September 15, 2008. Lehman Brothers, a titan of Wall Street, an untouchable fortress that survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and countless economic panics, officially filed for bankruptcy, suffocating under a mountain of toxic debt worth over $600 billion. Boom! The death of Lehman Brothers was a financial nuclear detonation. Think of the global banking system as the human body's circulatory system, and cash as the blood. When Lehman died, the heart stopped beating. Total panic gridlocked the global markets. Bankers looked at the guy sitting next to them and thought, "Is your balance sheet a fraud?" Then they looked at their own books and realized, "Holy shit, -2." Trust vanished instantly. No bank would lend a single dime to another bank because no one knew who would survive until morning. The credit markets froze solid. The lifeblood of the global economy stopped pumping. Wall Street took a 10-meter dive headfirst into solid concrete, dragging stock exchanges from London to Tokyo to Paris down into the abyss with it. Let's pause and look past the jargon for a second. When the media talks about a financial crisis, they show you flashing red charts, percentage drops, and intellectual terms like liquidity crunches or technical recessions. But for ordinary people on the ground, those cards don't mean a damn thing. What they faced was brutal, painful, unvarnished misery. The elites on Wall Street played Russian roulette with the global economy. When they won, they pocketed the bonuses. But when they lost, the working class paid the bill. The crisis didn't stay on the flat screens of trading floors. It spilled into the streets, pounding on the front doors of everyday citizens. Millions of American families who worked hard, paid their taxes, and played by the rules woke up to foreclosure notices slapped on their windows. They were thrown out onto the pavement, their life savings erased because the house they bought was suddenly worth a fraction of the debt that they owed the bank. Tent cities, modern-day slums, began popping up like mushrooms right outside the wealthiest metropolitan areas in the United States. These were not inhabited by chronic vagrants. They were the new homes of the former middle class. You had 50-year-old men with master's degrees and 20 years of management experience putting on their last decent suit, standing in bread lines for hours under freezing snow just to get a warm bowl of soup for their kids. The sheer humiliation and powerlessness broke people. Suicide rates spiked, and obituary sections in local papers grew longer by the day. the American dream morphed into a living nightmare. And this contagion didn't care about borders. It rode the waves of global capital, crossed the Atlantic and tore Europe to shreds. Iceland, a highly prosperous nation, watched its entire banking ecosystem collapse in a single week, leaving its currency worthless. Greece spiraled into bankruptcy, sending citizens into the streets to riot as the government slashed pensions and healthcare just to bail out foreign lenders. The entire global economy fell into a lost decade of stagnation, leaving millions of college graduates with zero job prospects and no way to feed themselves. All of this human collateral damage occurred simply because a handful of men in air-conditioned boardrooms in New York decided to play dirty with the system. So, after engineering the greatest robbery in human history, what happened to the criminals? Did they go to trial? Were their mansions seized? Did they spend years in federal prison eating stale bread? Not even close. And this is the most sickening part of the entire saga. With the financial system on the verge of complete extinction, the US government stepped in and made a decision that will live in infamy. They engineered a multi-trillion-dollar bailout. And where did that astronomical sum come from? It was funded by taxpayers, the very people who had just lost their livelihoods and homes. The government took the victims' money and pumped it right back into the dying veins of the banks that caused the slaughter. They justified this corporate welfare with a shameless, arrogant phrase, "too big to fail." They claimed that if these banks died, the world would revert to the Stone Age. And so, the dark comedy reached its grand finale. The banks took the public cash, stabilized themselves, and by the very next year, the CEOs and executives handed themselves tens of millions of dollars in performance bonuses for successfully navigating the crisis. No criminal indictments, no orange jumpsuits for the financial elite. The elite rulebook of raw capitalism was laid bare for the world to see. Privatize the profits, socialize the losses. But history shows that absolute injustice is the perfect breeding ground for radical retaliation. Out of the ashes of 2008, fueled by pure public rage and a total loss of trust in centralized institutions, a quiet revolution was born. In October 2008, an anonymous programmer or group of programmers using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto published a 9-page white paper on a cryptography forum. It wasn't a manifesto. It was a blueprint for a weapon designed to break Wall Street's monopoly. A completely decentralized currency that operated independently of central banks, free from any government's power to manipulate, control, or print into oblivion to rescue their rich friends. It was called Bitcoin. Satoshi created Bitcoin with a singular focus: to strip the absolute power of money printing away from the banks and give it back to the individual. Hidden within the Genesis block of the Bitcoin network, Satoshi permanently embedded a headline from the Times newspaper dated that exact period: Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. It was a permanent declaration of war, a digital scar reminding the world exactly why this technology had to exist. The old guard of the financial system has since patched up the cracks with thousands of pages of new regulations and endless money printing to manufacture an illusion of safety. But human nature hasn't changed, and the hunger of Wall Street has never slept. Right now, they're looking for the next loophole, building even more convoluted financial products to keep their casino running. The machine is still humming, but is it actually safe? Or are we just feeding a much larger monster, packing even more dynamite under the foundation for an even bigger explosion down the road? Will these decentralized techniques be our only exit strategy, or are they just evolving into the next massive hyper-volatile bubble?